Hi, young agents. My name is Viktoria, and I hope you're having a great day today. If you're interested in true crime like I am, I hope that you would consider hitting the subscribe button. But either way, thanks for being here. Today, we're gonna be talking about the case of West Memphis Three American men who in 1994, while teenagers, were found guilty of murdering 3 young boys in West Memphis and later were released. Few people who have watched the documentary film Paradise Lost remain unconvinced by its central tenet that the young men imprisoned in 1994 for the murder of 3 boys at Robin Hood Hills in West Memphis, Arkansas, were wrongly convicted. The film makes a persuasive case that the accused men, Damien Echols, Jesse Miskelly, and Jason Baldwin, suffered a miscarriage of justice. Victims of a prejudiced police and legal system that discriminated against them because they were wired kids who dressed in black and liked heavy metal music. It's an all too familiar story and one of those in the audience for true crime documentaries are predisposed to believe. Many similar films have documented such true stories of minorities, misfits, and outsiders being railroaded and wrongly convicted of heinous crimes by small-minded, conservative legal systems. The film studies follows the familiar pattern. Damien Echols and his friends were scary and strange teenagers who liked heavy metal music and even indulged in satanic rituals in the woods. When 3 young boys are murdered and dumped, hogtied and naked in local woodlands, provincial-minded police quickly focused with scant evidence on the teenagers as the likely perpetrators. The Paradise Lost films were influential in publicizing the case. The small-minded local community turned on the accused, false testimony and confessions were suborned by the police. And with the recent satanic panic scare still in people's minds, prosecutors distorted facts and unfairly used the boys' lifestyle and demeanor against them at the trial. But what if the prejudice in this case was the other way around? What if the real distortions and manipulations were committed by the films rather than the prosecution? Is it possible there was a genuine case against the 3 men, one that is a lot stronger than depicted in Paradise Lost? Could liberal audiences, rightly outraged by similar miscarriages, have rushed to their own judgments? This possibility has been almost entirely overlooked by the extraordinary judgment created by Paradise Lost. From the original 1996 documentary by directors Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sianovsky, its sequels, several other films, and the advocacy of major Hollywood figures such as Johnny Depp and Peter Jackson, a huge innocence campaign was sprung that eventually led to the man's release in 2011. Although never actually exonerated of the crime, so great was the negative publicly generated against the Arkansas justice system that an unusual and little used legal technicality was negotiated between the defense team and the state, and the 3 men were finally released after serving 18 years of their sentences. It's not hard to see why the ordeal of the West Memphis Three has had such strong impact on the public consciousness and why the 3 men's case has continued to be promoted by high-profile figures in the film and music world such as Henry Rollins, the band Metallica, and director Peter Jackson, who donated $10 million to their defense. The story fixed in the public mind by Paradise Lost and its sequels of troubled teenagers persecuted because they were different is 1 million of people around the world can identify and sympathize with, not least those in the creative industries. But with so much myth, propaganda and rumor have been spread since the three men were jailed, it's easy to forget exactly why they were convicted in the first place. The films and the innocence campaigners have done such a good job of editing out many of the inconvenient facts and evidence that many are unaware that a solid case exists against the man at all. Could it be those original detectives and prosecutors, most of whom maintain the men are guilty, were right after all? To understand why Hollywood may have made a great mistake in their advocacy of the West Memphis Three, we must travel back to a nightmare day in 1993 when this terrible story begins. Police in the small Arkansas city of West Memphis were first alerted that something was wrong on the night of May 5, 1993. The parents of three local boys had reported their sons, 8 years old Steve Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, missing. A small search was conducted in the surrounding area, but no trace of the children was found. Concern for the boys deepened after they had still not been found by the following morning, and a major search was launched by the police and country search and rescue at 8 a.m. A police helicopter swept the whole area, and 50 searchers, including many local volunteers, focused on an area of woods in West Memphis called Robin Hood Hills. That afternoon, the grimest of discoveries was made. Parole officer Steve Jones found a black tennis shoe near to where the woods bordered the Blue Beacon car wash. In a nearby ditch, Sergeant Mike Allen then discovered the naked body of a boy, his hands tied together with shoelaces, and following the course of the ditch, the bound bodies of two more boys were soon found. The boys' clothes were found scattered around the creek. Some items had been pushed into the mud with sticks, and the trousers were inside out. One of the boys, later identified as Chris Byers, was covered in laceration and had had the skin from his penis and scrotum removed. The autopsy found that Chris had died from knife wounds and Steve Branch and Michael Moore from drowning. Luminol tests revealed enough blood on the ground to indicate they were probably killed where they were found. A lack of tracks or track marks also indicated the boys had been attacked and killed in the woods. The fact there were 3 victims and they were tied up with 3 different types of knots pointed to multiple killers. Although only 8-year-old, it was difficult to see how one man could have subdued and murdered the 3 boys without at least one of them escaping and calling for help. With stories that satanic ceremonies were occurring in the woods already circulating in the local community, the idea there was some ritual element in the murder quickly spread. Steve Jones and another juvenile parole office cherry driver immediately suspected a troubled local 18-year-old man named Damien Echols. His history of psychiatric problems and strange, violent behavior singled him out to driver. With evil tattooed across his knuckles, his black clothes, and self-confessed interest in the occult, the major also outraged driver's conservative, insular mindset. The day after the murders, driver made his suspicions about Echols known to the West Memphis police. The Innocence campaign has made legitimate criticize them about the blinkered attitude of people like Steve Jones and Jerry Driver. Much of their aversion to Echols was based on petty prejudice rather than hard facts. However, once the police were made aware of the teenager, a very real case quickly developed against him, and one nothing to do with how he dressed. Police first interviewed Damien on May 7th and would talk to him several times in the next few days. Echols told them he was at home the night of the murders and spent much of the evening talking on the phone with several of his girlfriends. Aside from his alibi, some of Echols' statements in these interviews are strange and alarming enough to naturally attract the suspicion of detectives. Whilst Echols denied any knowledge of the murders, he appeared to have some startling insights into the killers. West Memphis police detective Bryn Rich notes state, when asked about how he thought the person felt that had done the homicide, he stated that the person probably felt good about what he had done and what he felt good that he had the power to do what he had done. The teenager also had something to say about the killer's methodology. Damien stated that he figured that the killer knew the kids went into the woods and even asked them to come out to the woods. He stated that the boys weren't big, not smart, and they would have been easy to control. He also felt the killer wouldn't have been worried about the boys screaming due to it being in the woods and close to the expressway. Innocence advocates have dismissed the statements by Echols as simply a cocky, intelligent teenager being smart with local cops whom he probably regarded as his intellectual inferior. Whilst this is clearly a possibility with 3 children having just been murdered, no detective could reasonably make the same determination. Echols' interviews in the days following the murders also brought another name to the attention of the police, a 16-year-old friend of his named Jason Baldwin. Unlike Echols, nothing Baldwin told the detectives stood out as particularly unusual. It was a phone call received by the police on May 9th that really turned Echols into a major suspect. Nerlene Hollingsworth, the aunt of Damien's girlfriend Dominique, called the West Memphis police to report a sighting of Echols near the murder scene on the night of the killings. According to her and 3 other members of her family, they saw Echols at around 9:30 p.m. walking in an area very close to where the body was later found. One of the Paradise Lost's most egregious distortions that it cast the police's focus on Echols as unwarranted. The West Memphis police honesty and competence have been repeatedly questioned over the years, but by May 10th, they had genuine reason to believe that Echols was both lying to them about his alibi and was near the murder scene at the time the boys died. Knowing this, no police force in the country could regard him as anything other than a major suspect. The case against Echols developed further when the name of another local teenager, 17-year-old Jesse Miscellany, came to the police's attention. Miscellany's role in the story would perhaps become the most controversial and debated aspect of the entire case, and pivotal to the arguments of both the innocent and guilty camps. Miscellany was a local dropout who worked odd jobs, had a low IQ, and a history of petty crime and violence. Police first talked to him as a witness on June 3rd. Sensationally, within hours, Miscellany would confess to the entire crime, stating that he, Damien Echols, and Jason Baldwin had beaten and murdered the boys. On the basis of the confession, Miscellany and the other 2 suspects were arrested and charged with the murders. Miscellany's statements would form one of the cornerstones of the case against the 3 men. Because of this, Paradise Lost and the Innocence campaign also focused on Miscellany and his confessions, arguing they were forced by the police. According to Paradise Lost, Misleading was a vulnerable minor, a teenager with a very low IQ and learning difficulties who was interrogated for 12 hours on his own without his parents or legal representation. Under intense pressure from detectives, Misleading falsely confessed to a crime he and his two friends did not commit. This false confession narrative is central to the entire Innocence campaign, but it's seriously misrepresented in the films. In actual fact, Jesse confesses multiple times, often in private to his own defense lawyers and away from police pressure. Similarly misleading is the way the films treat Misleading's alleged intellectual dysfunction and the circumstances surrounding his police interviews. Even when Paradise Lost makes a valid point, it's often undermined by its one-sided treatment of the facts and omission of proper context to what's happening. Because he was accusing the other two suspects, Misleading was tried separately from Echols and Baldwin. Despite the shortcomings of the prosecution case alleged by the Innocence campaign, two separate juries in 1994 were sufficiently convinced to convict the three men. Echols was sentenced to death and Baldwin and Misleading were sentenced to life imprisonment. None of the films makes any attempt to interview the jury members to try and understand why they thought the men were guilty, settling instead to insinuate that they were gullible and prejudiced for doing so. The first Paradise Lost film was released in 1996, building on an inchoate campaign that was developing on the then emerging internet. Sequels released in 2000 and 2011 followed the portraits of the men and their attempts to get the verdict overturned. West of Memphis, produced by Peter Jackson and Damien Echols himself, was released in 2012. Covering much the same ground as Paradise Lost, the film concludes with the deal made between prosecutors and the defense team that saw the man released in 2011. The rarely used Alford plea allowed the man to be released on the condition that they admit the state had enough evidence to convict them should the case go to another trial. Essentially, it allowed Echols, Baldwin, and Misleading to protest their innocence for the cameras whilst officially pleading guilty to the crime. These later films have attracted criticism for making allegations against some of the murdered boys' fathers. Suspicion is cast variously upon both John Mark Bayer and Terry Hobbs, often using the same kind of scant evidence and innuendo the filmmakers accused the prosecution of using. The case of the West Memphis Three would probably be unknown outside of Arkansas if not for these films, and especially the high-profile support Echols, Baldwin, and Misleading have received from the film and music industry. Their advocacy catapulted their relatively obscure case into an international cause celebrity cited as a notorious miscarriage of justice in countless newspaper stories, magazine articles, books, and television programs. West Memphis itself was widely depicted as a rural backwater with a corrupt and incompetent police and courts. Little attention was paid to dissenting voices. Award-winning journalist Billy Sinclair began writing about crime and justice whilst serving a 40-year prison sentence for murder in the 1970s. Now released, he believes the West Memphis Three are guilty. He said, "I concluded and I'm still convinced that they were guilty. My gut feeling is that if a person is truly innocent, who has spent 18 years fighting for his innocence, he's not going to go and plead guilty to killing 3 8-year-old boys unless he's guilty." Are skeptics like Sinclair right? Were the West Memphis Three guilty of the murders of the children at Robin Hood Hills in 1993? The murders were thought to have occurred sometime between about 6:30 p.m. when the boys were last seen at 8 p.m. Also glossed over in Paradise Lost, none of the men have been able to produce a convincing alibi for this time. His maintenance interview, Echols states that was at home all night talking to various girls on the phone. However, when police found and interviewed the 4 girls named in Echols' statement, they all contradicted his account. 10-year-old Jennifer Burden did talk to Damien a few times a day, but it was not during the time frame of the murder. In her statement, she says she called Echols at around 8 p.m., but his grandmother answered and said he was out. 2 other girls, Heather Cleet and Holly George, also talked to Echols by phone that day, but were unable to contact him between about 9 and 10:30 p.m. The next day, Holly later told Heather that Damien said he had been out walking around at the time. Even more damaging for Echols is the testimony of the Hollingsworth family. Darlene Hollingsworth, along with 3 members of her family, were driving in the area of Robin Hood Hills around 9:30 p.m. when they saw Echols with his girlfriend Dominique walking along a road just 200 yards from where the bodies were found. According to the family, Echols was covered in mud. All 4 of the Hollingsworth family knew Echols well, and their sighting was and remains a major problem for the Innocence campaign. Not only does it place Damien Echols near the murder site at around the time the boys were killed, it contradicts his own alibi. The fact the murdered boys were found dumped in a muddy ditch also casts the observation that Echols was covered in mud in a further suspicious light. Echols has continued to lie about his alibi in his many media interviews. In 2010, he told CNN, "At the time the police say the murders took place, I was actually on the phone with 3 different people. The problem was my attorney never called them to the stand." Clearly, if Echols' lawyers had evidence that he was elsewhere when the crimes occurred, then they would have used it. That they don't call the girls it because they would have contradicted their client's alibi, an inconvenient fact that both Damien Echols and the Paradise Lost films are keen we don't know. There are also no reason to believe the defense team wouldn't have had access to the phone records for the night. Tellingly, since Echols would probably have been acquitted if the phone alibi story was true, they don't use them. Jason Baldwin's alibi proved too flimsy and inconsistent to use at trial. His lawyers found it so difficult to piece together any coherent timeline of Jason's whereabouts on the day that they took the unusual course of not presenting any alibi witness at all. One of the defense team lawyers, Paul Ford, explained this decision in 2008. "I concluded from my efforts that I didn't find successfully what I was looking for the purposes of establishing an alibi that I felt would not unreveal on me, which I believe is much more detrimental than not presenting one at all." Jesse Miskelly's alibi initially looked stronger. His defense attorneys found several people who were willing to testify that Miskelly was attending a wrestling game in Dallas at the time of the murders. The wrestling story features prominently in Paradise Lost and West of Memphis, but the films leave out some important context. In actual fact, the alibi largely crumbled under cross-examination, and the witnesses were inconsistent and contradicted each other. The prosecution team also produced a receipt which suggested the trip had probably occurred in April before the murders. Tellingly, Miskelly never mentions the wrestling trip in any of his police statements. Is it really credible that none of the 3 accused men are able to provide a good alibi for the most infamous night in West Memphis history? Real innocent people are obviously somewhere else and they leave a trace behind. If the men really aren't guilty, then they are incredibly unlikely to be unable to convincingly account for their true whereabouts. The films and later Echols himself have done a good job in portraying the then 18-year-old as an outsider who was persecuted in a small Christian community because he was a goth who had an interest in the occult. What the Innocence campaign studiously avoid is the fact that Echols was actually mentally ill at the time of the murders. A self-confessed psychopath with a long history of serious psychiatric problems. Echols had been hospitalized for mental health issues twice the previous year. His behavior often so extreme his own parents had become frightened of him. They told Echols' caseworker that they were frightened of him and what he can do, not only to them but to other children that reside in the home. During the sentences phase of the trial, when it was apparent that Echols may face the death penalty, his defense team prepared a large dossier known as Exhibit 500 detailing his psychiatric history over the previous few years. This was a standard procedure as it could be used as a mitigating factor in order to reduce a death sentence to life imprisonment. This document has unintended consequences when it was made public due to the catalog of aberrant behavior it detailed. Although downplayed by his advocates, the dossier details the deeply troubled mind of a young man teetering on the edge of psychopathy who was prone to violence and suffering delusions of grandeur. The report recounts Echols' frequent homicidal and suicidal thoughts, how he was obsessed with Satanism and the occult, believed he was possessed by a spirit called Rothy, and even believed he was God. Echols' frequent aggression was also a major concern. Several expositional reports from Echols' school detail his routine threats and violence against his classmates. He attacked many of his friends and even tried to gouge out the eye of one boy. 2 incidents are documented of him setting fire to his classroom. The aggression extended to his family members. While detained at Craig Country Juvenile Detention Center in 1992, a hospital's psychological assessment reported that Echols was presently in detention in Jonesboro, picked up for violation of probation, threatened to slit parents' throat, and add them alive. One recurrent theme from the Exhibit 500 is Echols' fixation with drinking blood. Several incidents are documented of him licking blood of other patients at hospital and trying to suck blood from people's necks. One particularly disturbing episode is described in his psychological evaluation. One of the kids at the detention hall cut his wrist. Damien grabbed his arm and began to suck the blood, smeared it over his body, and said he's a devil-worshipping vampire. Echols himself felt he was so mentally ill that he couldn't work. At the time of the murders, he had applied for and was receiving Social Security disability benefits for his psychiatric issues, describing himself on the application as homicidal, suicidal, manic depression, schizophrenia, psychopathic. More lurid allegations that Echols murdered and dismembered a dog are difficult to verify and hotly contested between both the pro and anti-camps. However, there is already enough in Exhibit 500 to conclude Echols was a dangerous individual who exhibited enough red flags to believe he was at least capable of doing something as terrible as the murders he was charged with. Another recurrent feature of ECcles behavior is his compulsive lying. With the Innocence campaign having almost entirely captured the mainstream narrative, ECcles has been free to make several obvious and unchallengeable lies about the case in many of his media interviews. Amongst Echols' most notable lies are his claim in 2010 that he did live in West Memphis at the time of the murders. As established at the trial on May 5, 1993, Echols actually lived at the Broadway Trailer Park in West Memphis, about 2 miles from the murder scene. Echols has also stated on several occasions since his release that he hardly ever visited West Memphis and wasn't familiar with Robin Hood Hills, where the murder occurred. This is hard to square with the fact that he had once lived in the Mayfair apartments, which overlooked the area. The apartments were so close to the murder scene that the crime scene tape was just yards from their front entrance. In the 1992-93 time frame, Echols would often be seen walking around the area of Robin Hood Hills and even stated so himself at his trial in 1994. His later attempts to distance himself from the crime scene are part of a wider attempt to rewrite the history of his involvement, something the films, especially the Echols-produced West of Memphis, have allowed him to do with impunity. By far the most egregious mispresentation in Paradise Lost and its sequels concerned Jesse Miscellany's confessions. If the films are to be believed, Miscellany was a man with a very low IQ who was interrogated without representation for 12 hours until he broke down and falsely confessed to the murders. The first mispresentation concerns Miscellany's IQ. It suited the defense case to portray Miscellany as borderline retarded, as it reinforced the narrative that he had been bullied into confessing by the police and his statements couldn't be trusted. Undoubtedly, Miscellany had quite a low IQ. He scored between 70 and 80 in various tests he was given. However, Miscellany was told by his lawyers a low IQ score would reduce the chance of him getting the death penalty. There is some evidence that his tests show signs of malingering or deliberately acting dumb to try and achieve a low score. Regardless of what his IQ tests say, Miscellany was a functional adult. He was literate, held down jobs, and had relationships with women. He operated at the level of millions of other Americans who managed to lead normal lives without being particularly smart. He even enrolled in college after his release. He was certainly not the gullible, mentally retarded man-child he was often depicted as by innocence campaigners. The key aspect of the false confession narrative advocated by Paradise Lost is that Miscellany was interrogated for 12 hours without his parents' permission or the presence of a lawyer. Even a cursory study of the police records showed this to be untrue. In actual fact, Miscellany was first contacted by the police as a witness. CGT Mike Allen talked to his Miscellany's father on the morning of the 3rd of June about interviewing Jesse. His father agreed and went and fetched his son, who was then driven to the police station by Allen. His father knew what was happening with his son at all times. He even went to the station mid-morning to sign a permission for him to Miscellany to administer a polygraph test, and he failed the test. It is often claimed by innocence advocates that Jesse Miscellany wasn't read his Miranda rights or didn't understand his rights during this interview. This claim had been made so many times that it's become a kind of article of faith, despite the fact it's entirely untrue. The tapes and transcripts of the interview, as well as 2 initial forms, clearly reveal that Miscellany is actually read his rights on multiple occasions during the June 3rd interview. Miscellany also fully understood what his rights were. He had had numerous prior encounters with law enforcement and had read and signed Miranda waivers on at least 4 occasions before. The transcript also reveals that Miscellany was offered and turned down the opportunity to have a lawyer during this interview. Miscellany arrived at the police station at about 10 p.m. He confessed to the crime at 2:20 p.m. Only a few hours of this 4.5 hours actually consisted of interviews. There never was a 12-hour interrogation. It's an invention of the Innocence campaign and Paradise Lost. False confessions are quite well understood in criminology. They happen under situations of intense stress and pressure and are almost immediately retracted when the suspect is released from the pressure of the interrogation. Misleading doesn't fit this pattern at all. After his June 3rd confession, he makes numerous other confessions. 8 days later, Misleading confesses again in private to his own defense lawyers, Dan Stidham and Greg Crow. In further prison interviews with Stidham in February 1994, Misleading confesses again on one occasion with his hand on a Bible. After his conviction in February, Misleading again admits he committed the crime to police officers transporting him to prison. Then, in an extraordinary tape-recorded conversation with his attorneys on February 17th, Misleading stridently reaffirms his guilt as Stidham and Crow can be heard pleading with him not to. He is then interviewed by the prosecution team where he gives a long and detailed account of how he, Baldwin, and Echols murdered the boys. Paradise Lost and West Memphis failed to mention the 17th February confession or the many other confessions Misleading made. They don't fit the narrative of a mentally inadequate man being coerced into confessing by vicious police bullying. No explanation has ever been given as to how a man who apparently is coerced into falsely confessing is also able to confidently and defiantly resist the coercion of his own lawyers not to confess. Some evidence exists to suggest Misleading confessed even before the police first talked to him. A friend of Jesse Misleading named Buddy Lucas told police that on May 6, Misleading told him he was present when the boys were murdered. Lucas stated that Misleading broke down and cried whilst talking to him. Numerous other witnesses, including Misleading's father's girlfriend, reported similar uncharacteristic crying fits from teenager in the days following the murders. Although less central to the case, there were also some accounts of confessions to the crimes from Echols and Baldwin. Two peripheral friends of the boys, William Winford and Ken Watkins, both reported to police that they had heard Echols claim responsibility for the murders. A group of girls at a softball game also reported hearing Damien Echols brag about the crimes. Echols denied making the statements at his trial, and innocence campaigners have long rubbished the girls' testimony. However, in later years, Echols admitted he did brag about killing the boys at a softball game, but stated he probably said it is a joke. It's often claimed that no physical evidence connects the West Memphis Three to the murder of the boys at Robin Hood Hills. However, a knife found in the lake behind Jason Baldwin's trailer provided a solid, if not entirely undisputed, link between the teenager and the crimes. In November 1993, while the suspects were awaiting trial, West Memphis police began a search for evidence relating to the crime and quickly focused in on a large area of water behind the trailer park where Jason lived at the time of the murders. This looked a likely place where possible murder weapons may have been disposed. Police divers found various items in the lake, including footwear and a jacket. Among the items was a large survival-type knife with a serrated edge and a circular opening in the base of the handle that had one-held a screw-in compass. Police believed the saw-like serrated edge of the knife matched some of regularly spaced, incised wounds observed on the bodies of Chris Byers and Steve Branch. At the trial, prosecution lawyers famously attempted to demonstrate how this knife could have made the wounds by using it on a grapefruit. The prosecution also called witnesses who claimed to have seen the knife in Jason Baldwin's trailer around the time of the murders. Anna Holcomb, Damien Echols' ex-girlfriend, also told the court that she had previously seen Echols with a similar knife. The defense team and innocence advocates have tried to counter the knife evidence in various ways over the years. They have dismissed the knife-like marks on the boys' bodies as teeth marks or animal predation. Paradise lawsuit tries to argue some of the wounds were human bite marks and insinuates they were made by John Mark Byers, whose eccentric behavior and recent dental surgery had caused rumors to spread in the local communities that he may have been involved in the murders. Recently, 2 forensic dentists have re-examined autopsy photos of the wounds and dismissed the bite mark thesis. Homer Campbell and Peter Loomis are both specialists in tool and bite mark identification who have given expert testimony in several court cases over the years. They both believe the wounds to the boys were produced by the so-called lake knife. I believe the injuries to the left forehead and upper lid of the left eye were produced by the knife recovered or one similar. I also sent the photos of the injuries and knife to another for evaluation and he agrees, Campbell stated. Loomis measured the wounds to Steve Branch's forehead and found they corresponded exactly to the dimension of the knife. The 3 lacerations under the eyebrow look like they were made by serrations on the backside of the knife. The lacerations measure 11 and 2 millimeters between them, and the serrated points on the knife vary between 11 and 11.4 millimeters. The circular butt of the Baldwin knife, measuring 29 and 8 millimeters in diameter, also matched almost exactly the 30 millimeters diameter of the circular wound that had been dismissed by the defense as a bite mark. Extraordinary way the size of the wounds precisely match the dimensions of the knife is striking. Will speculation if this knife had made the injuries to Branch's forehead while the compass section was still intact, then the metal pin at the center of the compass would also match exactly the clear X-shaped mark at the center of the wound. The knife is problematic for innocence advocates. It provides a solid forensic link between Jason Baldwin and the fatal wounds to Steve Branch. But like so much in the crime, this evidence is still far from conclusive and remains heavily disputed. But even knife, almost exactly matching the size and nature of the wounds, was found in the water behind Jason Baldwin's trailer entirely by coincidence, and it's unrelated to either the man or the crime, then yet again the West Memphis Three have been extraordinarily unlikely. At the trial, the prosecution presented several pieces of forensic evidence linking the suspects to the crime. The Innocence campaign and the Paradise Lost films have rightly pointed out how weak much of this evidence is. The truth is, with the possible exception of the lake knife, as discussed, no physical evidence firmly links either the West Memphis Three or any other suspect to the crimes. Attorney often beyond the expectation modern juries have for DNA and forensic evidence in murder trials. This expectation has become known as the CSI Effect, fostered by the widespread use of often exaggerated crime scene forensic in films and television shows. In reality, even today, in an era of extremely sophisticated DNA techniques, very few criminal cases revolve around forensic evidence. One study has only 13% of criminal cases having any kind of forensic evidence at all. And it's estimated that usable DNA evidence is left behind in only 4 and 5% of homicides. The lack of DNA evidence at the murder site in Robin Hood Hills is sometimes cited as an argument for the boys' innocence, but the truth is the absence of such evidence is much as would be expected, especially so because the boys were killed outdoors. Not only was the crime scene heavily contaminated by searchers and investigators, but the killers also dumped the bodies in water which washed off any forensic evidence that may have been present. What evidence, though, was inadequate as a serious argument for the man's guilt? Fiber evidence presented by the prosecution was too vague and could have matched almost anyone, not just the suspects. Some of the other evidence used by the prosecution was tangential at best. Blue candle wax found on one of the victims' clothing was only similar to wax found in Echols' bedroom and could have matched any number of other people who had candles in their home. DNA evidence found on Echols' necklace was consistent with that of Steve Branch, but also millions of other people. Whilst the frequent claim that Jesse Miscellany was coerced into confessing isn't supported by the evidence, much of what he says is undermined by its inaccuracy. A large amount of Miscellany's confession doesn't match the known details of the crime, and Paradise Lost and the Innocence campaign have done a good job in highlighting the manifest inconsistencies in his statements. Whilst he does get some important details correct, there are enough major discrepancies to make it hard to reconcile them with Miscellany actually being present during the murders. Several times in his confessions, he states that the victims were tied up with brown rope. This is untrue. They were tied up with their own shoelaces. If Miscellany was present, could he really have gotten such a basic detail wrong? The rope statement does sound like someone trying to imagine or guess how the crime was committed rather than having real first-hand knowledge. Miscellany almost certainly heard the many rumors about the crimes that were circulating in the area, and this may also have colored his statements. Numerous similar factual discrepancies have been highlighted by Innocence campaigners and are prominently featured in the Paradise Lost films. Miscellany tells police they skipped school that day and killed the boys around noon. They were actually killed in the late evening. He states that he witnesses Baldwin and Echols rape the boys, but the autopsies show that this didn't occur. There are some possible explanations for the inconsistency in Miscellany's statements. By his own admission, he was very drunk during the attacks, and the liquor bottle he says he threw under a bridge was later found by the police. He also admits to only being peripherally involved in the murders themselves. It's at least plausible that a combination of intoxication and distance from the acts of murder themselves account for his inaccuracy. We must also bear in mind that Miscellany, even if he was involved, was also a witness to a crime. Even genuine eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable and often give details that prove to be entirely untrue. This is not evidence they didn't witness the crime, just that the human memory is faulty and that when people are involved in shocking, chaotic, and confusing events, their recollections of them are often massively out of kilter with what actually happened. The case of the West Memphis Three is a miasma of claim and counterclaim. The murders are still fiercely debated online, largely curated by those who passionately believe in the innocence of the convicted man. Discussion is often bad-tempered with little ground given on either side. There is no doubt that the campaign kicked off by Paradise Lost in 1996 has proven to be one of the most successful in legal history. It led to the release of the man, created global outrage about their plight, and tainted the community of West Memphis with a lasting shame. This has led to a great deal of resentment in the town about how they have been depicted in the media. Whether the men are guilty or innocent may never be determined. Perhaps only another confession or the capture of the real killers will settle the matter once and for all. Polarized nature of the debate seems to force us to make a binary choice between two grave injustices. Either three young men lost 18 years of their life for a crime they didn't commit, or 3 heinous murders were unfairly released. Whatever the truth is, there was a real case against them back in 1994, regardless of what the makers of Paradise Lost and Damien Echols would now have us believe. It's just sometimes prejudice works both ways. Were the West Memphis Three released in 2011 after a high-profile innocence campaign guilty after all? So, young entrants, write down what do you think, are the West Memphis Three guilty or not? Thank you for watching this episode and see you the next time.